Section 1 of Selected Interviews with Robert G. Ingersoll, Volume 1. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Prologue and Interviewer's Questions read by Michele Fry, Baton Rouge, Louisiana. Ingersoll's Responses read by Ted DeLorme. Interview title, Orators and Oratory. Published in The Sketch, London, England, March 21, 1894. Prologue. It was at his own law office in New York City that I had my talk with that very notable American, Colonel Robert G. Ingersoll. Bob Ingersoll, Americans call him affectionately. In a company of friends, it is the Colonel. A more interesting personality it would be hard to find, and those who know even a little of him will tell you that a bigger-hearted man probably does not live. Suppose a well-knit frame, grown stouter than it once was, and a fine, strong face, with a vivid gleam in the eyes, a deep, uncommonly musical voice, clear-cut, decisive, and a manner entirely delightful, yet tinged with a certain reserve. Introduce a smoking cigar, the smoke rising in little curls and billows, then imagine a rugged sort of picturesqueness in dress, and you get, not by any means the man, but still some notion of Bob Ingersoll. Colonel Ingersoll stands at the front of American orators. The natural thing, therefore, was that I should ask him, a master in the art, about oratory. What he said I shall give in his own words precisely as I took them down from his lips, for in the case of such a good commander of the old English tongue, that is of some importance. But the wonderful limpidness, the charming pellucidness of Ingersoll can only be adequately understood when you also have the finishing touch of his facile voice. First question. I should be glad if you would tell me what you think the differences are between English and American oratory.
There is no difference between the real English and the real American orator. Oratory is the same the world over. The man who thinks on his feet, who has the pose of passion, the face that thought illumines, a voice in harmony with the ideals expressed, who has logic like a column and poetry like a vine, who transfigures the common, dresses the ideals of the people in purple and fine linen, who has the art of finding the best and noblest in his hearers, and who in 1,000 ways creates the climate in which the best grows and flourishes and bursts into blossom, that man is an orator, no matter of what time, of what country.
If you were to compare individual English and American orators, recent or living orators in particular, what would you say?
I have never heard any of the great English speakers, and consequently can pass no judgment as to their merits, except such as depends on reading. I think, however, the finest paragraph ever uttered in Great Britain was by Curran in his defense of Rowan. I have never read one of Mr. Gladstone's speeches, only fragments. I think he lacks logic. Bright was a great speaker, but he lacked imagination and the creative faculty. Disraeli spoke for the clubs, and his speeches were artificial. We have had several fine speakers in America. I think that Thomas Corwin stands at the top of the natural orators. Sergeant S. Prentice, the lawyer, was a very great talker. Henry Ward Beecher was the greatest orator that the pulpit has produced. Theodore Parker was a great orator. In this country, however, probably Daniel Webster occupies the highest place in general esteem.
Which would you say are the better orators, speaking generally, the American people or the English people?
I think Americans are, on the average, better talkers than the English. I think England has produced the greatest literature of the world, but I do not think England has produced the greatest orators of the world. I know of no English orator equal to Webster or Corwin or Beecher.
Would you mind telling me how it was you came to be a public speaker, a lecturer, an orator?
We call this America of ours free, and yet I found it was very far from free. Our writers and our speakers declared that here in America church and state were divorced. I found this to be untrue. I found that the church was supported by the state in many ways, that people who failed to believe certain portions of the creeds were not allowed to testify in courts, or to hold office. It occurred to me that someone ought to do something toward making this country intellectually free, and after a while I thought that I might as well endeavor to do this as wait for another. This is the way in which I came to make speeches. It was an action in favor of liberty. I have said things because I wanted to say them, and because I thought they ought to be said.
Perhaps you will tell me your methods as a speaker, for I'm sure it would be interesting to know them.
Sometimes, and frequently, I deliver a lecture several times before it is written. I have it taken by a shorthand writer and afterwards written out. At other times I have dictated a lecture and delivered it from manuscript. The course pursued depends on how I happen to feel at the time. Sometimes I read a lecture, and sometimes I deliver lectures without any notes, this again depending much on how I happen to feel. So far as methods are concerned, everything should depend on feeling. Attitude, gestures, voice, emphasis should all be in accord with and spring from feeling, from the inside.
Is there any possibility of your coming to England? And I need hardly add, of your coming to speak?
I have thought of going over to England, and I may do so. There is an England in England for which I have the highest possible admiration. The England of culture, of art, of principle.
End of Orators and Oratory. Section 2 of Selected Interviews with Robert G. Ingersoll, Volume 1. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Interviewer's question read by Michele Fry, Baton Rouge, Louisiana. Ingersoll's response read by Ted DeLorme. Interview title, How to Become an Orator. Printed in the New York Sun, April 1898. Question. What advice would you give a young man who was ambitious to become a successful public speaker or orator?
In the first place, I would advise him to have something to say, something worth saying, something that people would be glad to hear. This is the important thing. Back of the art of speaking must be the power to think. Without thoughts, words are empty purses. Most people imagine that almost any words, uttered in a loud voice and accompanied by appropriate gestures, constitute an oration. I would advise the young man to study his subject, to find what others had thought, to look at it from all sides. Then I would tell him to write out his thoughts, or to arrange them in his mind, so that he would know exactly what he was going to say. Waste no time on the how until you are satisfied with the what. After you know what you are to say, then you can think of how it should be said. Then you can think about tone, emphasis, and gesture. But if you really understand what you say, emphasis, tone, and gesture will take care of themselves. All these should come from the inside. They should be in perfect harmony with the feelings. Voice and gesture should be governed by the emotions. They should unconsciously be in perfect agreement with the sentiments. The orator should be true to his subject should avoid any reference to himself. The great column of his argument should be unbroken. He can adorn it with vines and flowers, but they should not be in such profusion as to hide the column. He should give variety of episode by illustrations, but they should be used only for the purpose of adding strength to the argument. The man who wishes to become an orator should study language. He should know the deeper meaning of words. He should understand the vigor and velocity of verbs and the color of adjectives. He should know how to sketch a scene, to paint a picture, to give life and action. He should be a poet and a dramatist, a painter and an actor. He should cultivate his imagination. He should become familiar with the great poetry and fiction, with splendid and heroic deeds. He should be a student of Shakespeare. He should read and devour the great plays. From Shakespeare he could learn the art of expression, of compassion, and all the secrets of the head and heart. The great orator is full of variety, of surprises. Like a juggler, he keeps the colored balls in the air. He expresses himself in pictures. His speech is a panorama. By continued change he holds the attention. The interest does not flag. He does not allow himself to be anticipated. A picture is shown but once, so an orator should avoid the commonplace. There should be no stuffing, no filling. He should put no cotton with his silk, no common metals with his gold. He should remember that gilded dust is not as good as dusted gold. The great orator is honest, sincere. He does not pretend. His brain and heart go together. Every drop of his blood is convinced. Nothing is forced. He knows exactly what he wishes to do, knows when he has finished it, and stops. Only a great orator knows when and how to close. Most speakers go on after they are through. They are satisfied only with a lame and impotent conclusion. Most speakers lack variety. They travel a straight and dusty road. The great orator is full of episode. He convinces and charms by indirection. He leaves the road, visits the fields, wanders in the woods, listens to the murmurs of springs, the songs of birds. He gathers flowers, scales the crags, and comes back to the highway refreshed, invigorated. He does not move in a straight line. He wanders and winds like a stream. Of course, no one can tell a man what to do to become an orator. The great orator has that wonderful thing called presence. He has that strange something known as magnetism. He must have a flexible, musical voice, capable of expressing the pathetic, the humorous, the heroic. His body must move in unison with his thought. He must be a reasoner, a logician. He must have a keen sense of humor, of the laughable. He must have wit, sharp and quick. He must have sympathy. His smiles should be the neighbors of his tears. He must have imagination. He should give eagles to the air, and painted moths should flutter in the sunlight. While I cannot tell a man what to do to become an orator, I can tell him a few things not to do. There should be no introduction to an oration. The orator should commence with his subject. There should be no prelude, no flourish, no apology, no explanation. He should say nothing about himself. Like a sculptor, he stands by his block of stone. Every stroke is for a purpose. As he works, the form begins to appear. When the statue is finished, the workman stops. Nothing is more difficult than a perfect close. Few poems, few pieces of music, few novels end well. A good story, a great speech, a perfect poem should end just at the proper point. The bud, the blossom, the fruit. No delay. A great speech is a crystallization in its logic, an efflorescence in its poetry. I have not heard many speeches. Most of the great speakers in our country were before my time. I heard Beecher, and he was an orator. He had imagination, humor, and intensity. His brain was as fertile as the valleys of the tropics. He was too broad, too philosophic, too poetic for the pulpit. Now and then he broke the fetters of his creed, escaped from his orthodox prison, and became sublime. Theodore Parker was an orator. He preached great sermons. His sermons on old age and Webster, and his address on liberty, were filled with great thoughts, marvelously expressed. When he dealt with human events, with realities, with things he knew, he was superb. When he spoke of freedom, of duty, of living to the ideal, of mental integrity, he seemed inspired. Webster I never heard. He had great qualities, force, dignity, clearness, grandeur, but after all he worshipped the past. He kept his back to the sunrise. There was no dawn in his brain. He was not creative. He had no spirit of prophecy. He lighted no torch. He was not true to his ideal. He talked sometimes as though his head was among the stars, but he stood in the gutter. In the name of religion he tried to break the will of Stephen Girard, to destroy the greatest charity in all the world, and in the name of the same religion he defended the fugitive slave law. His purpose was the same in both cases. He wanted office. Yet he uttered a few very great paragraphs, rich with thought, perfectly expressed. Clay I never heard, but he must have had a commanding presence, a chivalric bearing, an heroic voice. He cared little for the past. He was a natural leader, a wonderful talker, forcible, persuasive, convincing. He was not a poet, not a master of metaphor, but he was practical. He kept in view the end to be accomplished. He was the opposite of Webster. Clay was the morning, Webster the evening. Clay had large views, a wide horizon. He was ample, vigorous, and a little tyrannical. Benton was thoroughly commonplace. He never uttered an inspired word. He was an intense egoist. No subject was great enough to make him forget himself. Calhoun was a political Calvinist, narrow, logical, dogmatic. He was not an orator. He delivered essays, not orations. I think it was in 1851 that Kossuth visited this country. He was an orator. There was no man at that time under our flag who could speak English as well as he. In the first speech I read of Kossuth's was the line, "Russia is the rock against which the sigh for freedom breaks." In this you see the poet, the painter, the orator. S. Prentice was an orator, but with the recklessness of a gamester he threw his life away. He said profound and beautiful things, but he lacked application. He was uneven, disproportioned, saying ordinary things on great occasions, and now and then, without the slightest provocation, uttering the sublimest and most beautiful thoughts. In my judgment, Corwin was the greatest orator of them all. He had more arrows in his quiver. He had genius. He was full of humor, pathos, wit, and logic. He was an actor. His body talked. His meaning was in his eyes and lips. Governor O.P. Morton of Indiana had the greatest power of statement of any man I have ever heard. All the argument was in his statement. The facts were perfectly grouped. The conclusion was a necessity. The best political speech I ever heard was made by Governor Richard J. Oglesby of Illinois. It had every element of greatness: reason, humor, wit, pathos, imagination, and perfect naturalness. That was in the grand years long ago. Lincoln had reason, wonderful humor and wit, but his presence was not good. His voice was poor, his gestures awkward, but his thoughts were profound. His speech at Gettysburg is one of the masterpieces of the world. The word "here" is used 4 or 5 times too often. Leave the "heres" out, and the speech is perfect. Of course, I have heard a great many talkers, but orators are few and far between. They are produced by victorious nations, born in the midst of great events, of marvelous achievements. They utter the thoughts, the aspirations of their age. They clothe the children of the people in the gorgeous robes of giants. They interpret the dreams. With the poets they prophesy. They fill the future with heroic forms, with lofty deeds. They keep their faces toward the dawn, toward the ever-coming day.
End of How to Become an Orator. Section 3 of Selected Interviews with Robert G. Ingersoll, Volume 1. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Prologue and interviewer's question read by Michele Fry, Baton Rouge, Louisiana. Ingersoll's response read by Claudia Salto. Interview title, My Belief and Unbelief. Printed in The Blade, Toledo, Ohio, January 9th, 1892. Colonel Robert G. Ingersoll was in Toledo for a few hours yesterday afternoon on railroad business. Whatever Mr. Ingersoll says is always read with interest, for besides the independence of his averments, his ideas are worded in a way that in itself is attractive. While in the courtroom talking with some of the officials and others, he was saying that in this world there is rather an unequal distribution of comforts, rewards, and punishments. For himself, he had fared pretty well. He stated that during the 30 years he has been married, there have been 15 to 20 of his relatives under the same roof, but never had there been in his family a death or a night's loss of sleep on account of sickness. "The Lord has been pretty good to you," suggested Marshall Wade. "Well, I've been pretty good to him," he answered. Interviewer's question. I have heard people, in discussing yourself and your views, express the belief that way down in the depths of your mind you're not altogether a disbeliever. Are they in any sense correct? Ingersoll's answer.
I am an unbeliever, and I am a believer. I do not believe in the miraculous, the supernatural, or the impossible. I do not believe in the Mosaic account of the creation, or in the flood, or the Tower of Babel, or that General Joshua turned back the sun or stopped the earth. I do not believe in the Jonah story, or that God and the devil troubled poor Job. Neither do I believe in the Mount Sinai business, and I have my doubts about the broiled quails furnished in the wilderness. Neither do I believe that man is wholly depraved. I have not the least faith in the Eden snake and apple story. Neither do I believe that God is an eternal jailer, that he is going to be the warden of an everlasting penitentiary in which the most of men are to be eternally tormented. I do not believe that any man can be justly punished or rewarded on account of his belief. But I do believe in the nobility of human nature. I believe in love and home and kindness and humanity. I believe in good fellowship and cheerfulness, and making wife and children happy. I believe in good nature, in giving to others all the rights that you claim for yourself. I believe in free thought, in reason, observation, and experience. I believe in self-reliance and in expressing your honest thought. I have hope for the whole human race. What will happen to one will, I hope, happen to all, and that, I hope, will be good. Above all, I believe in liberty.
End of My Belief and Unbelief. Section 4 of Selected Interviews with Robert G. Ingersoll, Volume 1. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Interviewers' questions read by Michele Fry, Baton Rouge, Louisiana. Ingersoll's responses read by Claudia Salto. Interview title, A Reply to the Reverend L.A. Banks. Printed in The Plain Dealer, Cleveland, Ohio, 1898. Interviewer's first question. Have you read the remarks made about you by the Reverend Mr. Banks, and what do you think of what he said?
The reverend gentleman pays me a great compliment by comparing me to a circus. Everybody enjoys the circus. They love to see the acrobats, the walkers on the tightrope, the beautiful girls on the horses, and they laugh at the wit of the clowns. They are delighted with the jugglers, with the music of the band. They drink the lemonade, eat the colored popcorn, and laugh until they nearly roll off their seats. Now, the circus has a few animals, so that Christians can have an excuse for going. Think of the joy the circus gives to the boys and girls. They look at the show bills, see the men and women flying through the air, bursting through paper hoops, the elephants standing on their heads, and the clowns in curious clothes, with hands on their knees and open mouths, supposed to be filled with laughter. All the boys and girls for many miles around know the blessed day. They save their money, obey their parents, and when the circus comes, they are on hand. They see the procession, and then they see the show. They are all happy. No sermon ever pleased them as much, and in comparison, even the Sunday school is tame and dull. To feel that I have given as much joy as the circus fills me with pleasure. What chance would the Reverend Dr. Banks stand against a circus? The reverend gentleman has done me a great honor, and I tender him my sincere thanks.
Dr. Banks says that you write only one lecture a year, while preachers write a brand new one every week. That if you did that, people would tire of you. What have you to say to that?
It may be that great artists paint only one picture a year, and it may be that sign painters can do several jobs a day. Still, I would not say that the sign painters were superior to the artists. There is quite a difference between a sculptor and a stone-cutter. There are thousands of preachers and thousands of sermons preached every year. Has any Orthodox minister in the year 1898 given just one paragraph to literature? Has any Orthodox preacher uttered one great thought, clothed in perfect English, that thrilled the hearers like music? One great strophe that became one of the treasures of memory? I will make the question a little clearer. Has any Orthodox preacher, or any preacher in an Orthodox pulpit, uttered a paragraph of what may be called sculptured speech since Henry Ward Beecher died? I do not wonder that the sermons are poor. Their doctrines have been discussed for centuries. There is little chance for originality. They not only thresh old straw, but they thresh straw that has been threshed 1,000,000 times, straw in which there has not been a grain of wheat for hundreds of years. No wonder that they have nervous prostration. No wonder that they need vacations, and no wonder that their congregations enjoy the vacations as keenly as the ministers themselves. Better deliver a real good address 52 times than 52 poor ones, just for the sake of variety.
Dr. Banks says that the tendency at present is not toward agnosticism, but toward Christianity. What is your opinion?
When I was a boy, infidels were very rare. A man who denied the inspiration of the Bible was regarded as a monster. Now there are in this country millions who regard the Bible as the work of ignorant and superstitious men. A few years ago the Bible was the standard. All scientific theories were tested by the Bible. Now science is the standard, and the Bible is tested by that. Dr. Banks did not mention the names of the great scientists who are or were Christians, but he probably thought of Laplace, Humboldt, Haeckel, Huxley, Spencer, Tyndall, Darwin, Helmholtz, and Draper. When he spoke of Christian statesmen, he likely thought of Jefferson, Franklin, Washington, Paine, and Lincoln, or he may have thought of Pierce, Fillmore, and Buchanan. But, after all, there is no argument in names. A man is not necessarily great because he holds office, or wears a crown, or talks in a pulpit. Facts, reasons, are better than names. But it seems to me that nothing can be plainer than that the Church is losing ground, that the people are discarding the creeds, and that superstition has passed the zenith of its power.
Dr. Banks says that Christ did not mention the Western Hemisphere because God does nothing for men that they can do for themselves. What have you to say?
Christ said nothing about the Western Hemisphere because he did not know that it existed. He did not know the shape of the earth. He was not a scientist, never even hinted at any science, never told anybody to investigate, to think. His idea was that this life should be spent in preparing for the next. For all the evils of this life and the next, faith was his remedy. I see from the report in the paper that Dr. Banks, after making the remarks about me, preached a sermon on Herod, the villain in the drama of Christ. Who made Herod? Dr. Banks will answer that God made him. Did God know what Herod would do? Yes. Did he know that he would cause the children to be slaughtered in his vain efforts to kill the infant Christ? Yes. Dr. Banks will say that God is not responsible for Herod because he gave Herod freedom. Did God know how Herod would use this freedom? Did he know that he would become the villain in the drama of Christ? Yes. Who, then, is really responsible for the acts of Herod? If I could change a stone into a human being, and if I could give this being freedom of will, and if I knew that if I made him he would murder a man, and if with that knowledge I made him and he did commit a murder, who would be the real murderer? Will Dr. Banks, in his 52 sermons of next year, show that his God is not responsible for the crimes of Herod? No doubt Dr. Banks is a good man, and no doubt he thinks that liberty of thought leads to hell, and honestly believes that all doubt comes from the devil. I do not blame him. He thinks as he must. He is a product of conditions. He ought to be my friend, because I am doing the best I can to civilize his congregation.
End of a reply to the Reverend L.A. Banks. Section 5 of Selected Interviews with Robert G. Ingersoll, Volume 1. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Interviewers' questions read by Michele Fry, Baton Rouge, Louisiana. Ingersoll's responses read by Claudia Salto. Interviewed title, Mrs. Van Cott, the Revivalist. Published in the Express, Buffalo, New York, February 1878. First question. I see, Colonel, that in an interview published this morning, Mrs. Van Cott, the revivalist, calls you, quote, a poor barking dog. Do you know her personally? Ingersoll's answer.
I have never met or seen her.
Do you know the reason she applied the epithet?
I suppose it to be the natural result of what is called vital piety. That is to say, universal love breeds individual hatred.
Do you intend making any reply to what she says?
I have written her a note, of which this is a copy. Buffalo, February 24th, 1878. Mrs. Van Cott. My dear Madam, were you constrained by the love of Christ to call a man who has never injured you a poor barking dog? Did you make this remark as a Christian or as a lady? Did you say these words to illustrate in some faint degree the refining influence upon women of the religion you preach? What would you think of me if I should retort, using your language, changing only the sex of the last word? I have the honor to remain yours truly, R. G. Ingersoll.
Well, what do you think of the religious revival system generally?
The fire that has to be blown all the time is a poor thing to get warm by. I regard these revivals as essentially barbaric. I think they do no good but much harm. They make innocent people think they are guilty, and very mean people think they are good.
What is your opinion concerning women as conductors of these revivals?
I suppose those engaged in them think they are doing good. They are probably honest. I think, however, that neither men nor women should be engaged in frightening people into heaven. That is all I wish to say on the subject, as I do not think it worth talking about.
End of Mrs. Van Cott, the Revivalist. Section 6 of Selected Interviews with Robert G. Ingersoll, Volume 1. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Interviewers' questions read by Michele Fry, Baton Rouge, Louisiana. Ingersoll's responses read by Edward Kirkby, Warwick, England. Interview title, Reply to Chicago Critics. Printed in the Chicago Tribune, September 30th, 1880. First question. Have you read the replies of the clergy to your recent lecture in this city on What Must We Do to Be Saved? And if so, what do you think of them?
I think they dodge the point. The real point is this. If salvation by faith is the real doctrine of Christianity, I asked on Sunday before last, and I still ask, why didn't Matthew tell it? I still insist that Mark should have remembered it, and I shall always believe that Luke ought at least to have noticed it. I was endeavouring to show that modern Christianity has for its basis an interpolation. I think I showed it. The only gospel on the orthodox side is that of John, and that was certainly not written, or did not appear in its present form, until long after the others were written. I know very well that the Catholic Church claimed during the Dark Ages, and still claims, that references had been made to the Gospels by persons living in the 1st, 2nd, and 3rd centuries, but I believe such manuscripts were manufactured by the Catholic Church. For many years in Europe there was not one person in 20,000 who could read and write. During that time the Church had in its keeping the literature of our world. They interpolated as they pleased, they created, they destroyed. In other words, they did whatever, in their opinion, was necessary to substantiate the faith. The gentleman who saw fit to reply did not answer the question, and I again call upon the clergy to explain to the people why, if salvation depends upon the belief on the Lord Jesus Christ, Matthew didn't mention it. Someone has said that Christ didn't make known his doctrine of salvation by belief or faith until after his resurrection. Certainly none of the Gospels were written until after his resurrection, and if he made that doctrine known after his resurrection and before his ascension, it should have been in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, as well as in John. The replies of the clergy show that they have not investigated the subject, that they are not well acquainted with the New Testament. In other words, they have not read it except with a regulation theological bias. There is one thing I wish to correct here. In an editorial in the Tribune, it was stated that I had admitted that Christ was beyond and above Buddha, Zoroaster, Confucius, and others. I did not say so. Another point was made against me, and those who made it seemed to think it was a good one. In my lecture I asked why it was that the disciples of Christ wrote in Greek, whereas, in fact, they understood only Hebrew. It is now claimed that Greek was the language of Jerusalem at that time, that Hebrew had fallen into disuse, that no one understood it except the literati and the highly educated. If I fell into an error upon this point, it was because I relied upon the New Testament. I find in the 21st chapter of the Acts an account of Paul having been mobbed in the city of Jerusalem, that he was protected by a chief captain and some soldiers, that while upon the stairs of the castle to which he was being taken for protection, he obtained leave from the captain to speak unto the people. In the 40th verse of that chapter I find the following: "And when he had given him license, Paul stood on the stairs, and beckoned with the hand unto the people. And when there was made a great silence, he spake unto them in the Hebrew tongue, saying." And then follows the speech of Paul, wherein he gives an account of his conversion. It seems a little curious to me that Paul, for the purpose of quieting a mob, would speak to that mob in an unknown language. If I were mobbed in the city of Chicago and wished to defend myself with an explanation, I certainly would not make that explanation in Choctaw, even if I understood that tongue. My present opinion is that I would speak in English, and the reason I would speak in English is because that language is generally understood in this city, and so I conclude from the account in the 21st chapter of the Acts that Hebrew was the language of Jerusalem at that time, or Paul would not have addressed the mob in that tongue.
Did you read Mr. Courtney's answer?
I read what Mr. Courtney read from others, and think some of his quotations very good, and have no doubt that the authors will feel complimented by being quoted. There certainly is no need of me answering Dr. Courtney. Sometime I may answer the French gentleman from whom he quoted.
But what about there being belief in Matthew?
Mr. Courtney says that certain people were cured of diseases on account of faith, admitting that mumps, measles, and whooping cough could be cured in that way. There is not even a suggestion that salvation depended upon a like faith. I think he can hardly afford to rely upon the miracles of the New Testament to prove his doctrine. There was one instance in which a miracle was performed by Christ without his knowledge, and I hardly think that even Mr. Courtenay would insist that any faith could have been great enough for that. The fact is, I believe that all these miracles were ascribed to Christ long after his death, and that Christ never, at any time or place, pretended to have any supernatural power whatever. Neither do I believe that he claimed any supernatural origin. He claimed simply to be a man, no less, no more. I do not believe Mr. Courtenay is satisfied with his own reply.
And now as to Professor Swing.
Mr. Swing has been out of the Orthodox Church so long that he seems to have forgotten the reasons for which he left it. I do not believe there is an Orthodox minister in the city of Chicago who will agree with Mr. Swing that salvation by faith is no longer preached. Professor Swing seems to think it is of no importance who wrote the Gospel of Matthew. In this I agree with him. Judging from what he said, there is hardly difference enough of opinion between us to justify a reply on his part. He, however, makes one mistake. I did not in the lecture say one word about tearing down churches. I have no objection to people building all the churches they wish. While I admit it is a pretty sight to see children on a morning in June going through the fields to the country church, I still insist that the beauty of that sight does not answer the question how it is that Matthew forgot to say anything about salvation through Christ. Professor Swing is a man of poetic temperament, but this is not a poetic question.
How did the card of Dr. Thomas strike you?
I think the reply of Dr. Thomas is in the best possible spirit. I regard him today as the best intellect in the Methodist denomination. He seems to have what is generally understood as a Christian spirit. He has always treated me with perfect fairness, and I should have said long ago many grateful things had I not feared I might hurt him with his own people. He seems to be by nature a perfectly fair man, and I know of no man in the United States for whom I have a profounder respect. Of course, I don't agree with Dr. Thomas. I think in many things he is mistaken, but I believe him to be perfectly sincere. There is one trouble about him. He is growing, and this fact will no doubt give great trouble to many of his brethren. Certain Methodist hazelbrush feel a little uneasy in the shadow of his oak. To see the difference between him and some others, all that is necessary is to read his reply, and then read the remarks made at the Methodist ministers' meeting on the Monday following. Compared with Dr. Thomas, they are as puddles by the sea. There is the same difference that there is between sewers and rivers, cesspools and springs.
What have you to say to the remarks of the Reverend Dr. Jewett before the Methodist ministers' meeting?
I think Dr. Jewett is extremely foolish. I did not say that I would commence suit against a minister for libel. I can hardly conceive of a proceeding that would be less liable to produce a dividend. The fact about it is that the Reverend Mr. Jewett seems to think anything true that he hears against me. Mr. Jewett is probably ashamed of what he said by this time. He must have known it to be entirely false. It seems to me by this time even the most bigoted should lose their confidence in falsehood. Of course there are times when a falsehood, well told, bridges over quite a difficulty, but in the long run you had better tell the truth, even if you swim the creek. I am astonished that these ministers were willing to exhibit their wounds to the world. I suppose, of course, I would hit some, but I had no idea of wounding so many.
Mr. Kraft stated that you were in the habit of swearing in company and before your family.
I often swear. In other words, I take the name of God in vain. That is to say, I take it without any practical thing resulting from it, and in that sense I think most ministers are guilty of the same thing. I heard an old story of a clergyman who rebuked a neighbor for swearing, to whom the neighbor replied, "You pray, and I swear, but as a matter of fact, neither of us means anything by it." As to the charge that I am in the habit of using indecent language in my family, no reply is needed. I am willing to leave that question to the people who know us both. Mr. Crafts says he was told this by a lady. This cannot by any possibility be true, for no lady will tell a falsehood. Besides, if this woman of whom he speaks was a lady, how did she happen to stay where obscene language was being used? No lady ever told Mr. Crafts any such thing. It may be that a lady did tell him that I used profane language. I admit that I have not always spoken of the devil in a respectful way, that I have sometimes referred to his residence when it was not a necessary part of the conversation, and that at divers times I have used a good deal of the terminology of the theologian when the exact words of the scientist might have done as well. But if by swearing is meant the use of God's name in vain, there are very few preachers who do not swear more than I do. If by in vain is meant without any practical result, I leave Mr. Crafts to cultivate the acquaintance of the unknown lady, knowing as I do that after they have talked this matter over again, they will find that both have been mistaken. I sincerely regret that clergymen who really believe that an infinite God is on their side think it necessary to resort to such things to defeat one man. According to their idea, God is against me, and they ought to have confidence in his infinite wisdom and strength to suppose that he could dispose of one man, even if they fail to say a word against me. Had you not asked me, I should have said nothing to you on these topics. Such charges cannot hurt me. I do not believe it possible for such men to injure me. No one believes what they say, and the testimony of such clergymen against an infidel is no longer considered of value. I believe it was Goethe who said, "I always know that I am travelling when I hear the dogs bark."
Are you going to make a formal reply to their sermons?
Not unless something better is done than has been. Of course, I don't know what another Sabbath may bring forth. I'm waiting. But of one thing I feel perfectly assured, that no man in the United States or in the world can account for the fact, if we are to be saved only by faith in Christ, that Matthew forgot it, that Luke said nothing about it, and that Mark never mentioned it except in two passages written by another person. Until that is answered, as one gravedigger says to the other in Hamlet, I shall say, "Ah, tell me that, and unyoke." In the meantime, I wish to keep on the best terms with all parties concerned. I cannot see why my forgiving spirit fails to gain their sincere praise.
End of reply to Chicago critics. Section 7 of Selected Interviews with Robert G. Ingersoll, Volume 1. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Interviewers' questions read by Michele Fry, Baton Rouge, Louisiana. Ingersoll's responses read by Scott Danaker, Elizabeth City, North Carolina. Interview title, Miracles and Immortality. Printed in the Dispatch, Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, December 11, 1880. First question. You have seen some accounts of the recent sermon of Dr. Tyng on miracles, I presume, and if so, what is your opinion of the sermon, and also what is your opinion of miracles? Ingersoll's answer.
From an orthodox standpoint, I think the Reverend Dr. Tyng is right. If miracles were necessary 1800 years ago, before scientific facts enough were known to overthrow hundreds and thousands of passages in the Bible, certainly they're necessary now. Dr. Tyng sees clearly that the old miracles are nearly worn out, and that some new ones are absolutely essential. He takes for granted that if God would do a miracle to found his gospel, he certainly would do some more to preserve it, and that it is in need of preservation about now is evident. I'm amazed that the religious world should laugh at him for believing in miracles. It seems to me just as reasonable that the deaf, dumb, blind, and lame should be cured at Lourdes as in Palestine. It certainly is no more wonderful that the law of nature should be broken now than that it was broken several thousand years ago. Dr. Tyng also has this advantage. The witnesses by whom he proves these miracles are alive. An unbeliever can have the opportunity of cross-examination, whereas the miracles in the New Testament are substantiated only by the dead. It is just as reasonable to me that blind people receive their sight in France as that devils were made to vacate human bodies in the Holy Land. For one, I am exceedingly glad that Dr. Tyng has taken this position. It shows that he is a believer in a personal God, in a God who is attending a little to the affairs of this world, and in a God who did not exhaust his supplies in the apostolic age. It is refreshing to me to find in this scientific age a gentleman who still believes in miracles. My opinion is that all thorough religionists will have to take the ground and admit that a supernatural religion must be supernaturally preserved. I have been asking for a miracle for several years, and have, in a very mild, gentle, and loving way, taunted the church for not producing a little one. I have had the impudence to ask any number of them to join in a prayer asking anything they desire for the purpose of testing the efficiency of what is known as supplication. They answer me by calling my attention to the miracles recorded in the New Testament. I insist, however, on a new miracle, and personally, I would like to see one now. Certainly the Infinite has not lost his power, and certainly the Infinite knows that thousands and hundreds of thousands, if the Bible is true, are now pouring over the precipice of unbelief into the gulf of hell. One little miracle would save thousands. One little miracle in Pittsburgh, well authenticated, would do more good than all the preaching ever heard in this sooty town. The Reverend Dr. Tyng clearly sees this, and he has been driven to the conclusion, first, that God can do miracles, second, that he ought to, and third, that he has. In this he is perfectly logical. After a man believes the Bible, after he believes in the flood and the story of Jonah, certainly he ought not to hesitate at a miracle of today. When I say I want a miracle, I mean by that I want a good one. All miracles recorded in the New Testament could have been simulated. A fellow could have pretended to be dead, or blind, or dumb, or deaf. I want to see a good miracle. I want to see a man with one leg, and then I want to see the other leg grow out. I would like to see a miracle like that performed in North Carolina. Two men were disputing about the relative merits of a salve they had for sale. One of the men, in order to demonstrate that his salve was better than any other, cut off a dog's tail and applied a little of the salve to the stump, and in the presence of the spectators a new tail grew out. But the other man, who also had a salve for sale, took the piece of the tail that had been cast away, put a little salve at the end of that, and a new dog grew out. And the last heard of those parties, they were quarreling as to who owned the second dog. Something like that is what I call a miracle.
What do you believe about the immortality of the soul? Do you believe that the spirit lives as an individual after the body is dead?
I've said a great many times that it is no more wonderful that we should live again than that we do live. Sometimes I've thought it not quite so wonderful for the reason that we have a start. But upon that subject, I haven't the slightest information. Whether man lives again or not, I cannot pretend to say. There may be another world, and there may not be. If there is another world, we ought to make the best of it after arriving there. If there is not another world, or if there is another world, we ought to make the best of this. And since nobody knows, all should be permitted to have their opinions. And my opinion is that nobody knows. If we take the Old Testament for authority, man is not immortal. The Old Testament shows man how he lost his immortality. According to Genesis, God prevented man from putting forth his hand and eating of the tree of life. It is there stated, had he succeeded, man would have lived forever. God drove him from this garden, preventing him from eating of this tree, and in consequence, man became mortal. So that if we go by the Old Testament, we are compelled to give up immortality. The New Testament has but little on the subject. In one place, we are told to seek for immortality. If we are already immortal, it's hard to see why we should go on seeking for it. In another place, we are told that they who are worthy to obtain that world and the resurrection of the dead are not given in marriage. From this, one would infer there would be some unworthy to be raised from the dead. Upon the question of immortality, the Old Testament throws but little satisfactory light. I don't deny immortality, nor would I endeavor to shake the belief of anybody in another life. What I am endeavoring to do is to put out the fires of hell. If we cannot have heaven without hell, I am in favor of abolishing heaven. I do not want to go to heaven if one soul is doomed to agony. I would rather be annihilated. My opinion of immortality is this. First, I live, and that of itself is infinitely wonderful. Second, there was a time when I was not, and after I was not, I was. Third, now that I am, I may be again, and it is no more wonderful that I may be again, if I have been, than that I am, having once been nothing. If the churches advocated immortality, if they advocated eternal justice, if they said that man would be rewarded and punished according to deeds, if they admitted that sometime in eternity there would be an opportunity given to lift up souls, and that throughout all the ages the angels of progress and virtue would beckon the fallen upward, and that sometime, and no matter how far away they might put off the time, all children of men would be reasonably happy, I never would say a solitary word against the church. But as long as they preach that the majority of mankind will suffer eternal pain, just so long shall I oppose them. That is to say, as long as I live.
Do you believe in a God? And if so, what kind of a God?
Let me, in the first place, lay a foundation for an answer. First, man gets all food for thought through the medium of the senses. The effect of nature upon the senses, and through the senses upon the brain, must be natural. All food for thought, then, is natural. As a consequence of this, there can be no supernatural idea in the human brain. Whatever idea there is must have been a natural product. If, then, there is no supernatural idea in the human brain, then there cannot be in the human brain an idea of the supernatural. If we can have no idea of the supernatural, and if the God of whom you spoke is admitted to be supernatural, then, of course, I can have no idea of him, and I certainly can have no very fixed belief on any subject about which I have no idea. There may be a God for all I know. There may be thousands of them. But the idea of an infinite being outside and independent of nature is inconceivable. I do not know of any word that would explain my doctrine or my views upon the subject. I suppose pantheism is as near as I can go. I believe in the eternity of matter and in the eternity of intelligence, but I do not believe in any being outside of nature. I don't believe in any personal deity. I don't believe in any aristocracy of the air. I know nothing about origin or destiny. Between these two horizons I live, whether I wish to or not, and must be satisfied with what I find between these two horizons. I have never heard any God described that I believe in. I have never heard any religion explained that I accept. To make something out of nothing cannot be more absurd than that an infinite intelligence made this world and proceeded to fill it with crime and want and agony, and then, not satisfied with the evil he had wrought, made a hell in which to consummate the great mistake.
Do you believe that the world and all that is in it came by chance?
I don't believe anything comes by chance. I regard the present as the necessary child of a necessary past. I believe matter is eternal, that it has eternally existed and eternally will exist. I believe that in all matter, in some way, there is what we call force, that one of the forms of force is intelligence. I believe that whatever is in the universe has existed from eternity and will forever exist. Secondly, I exclude from my philosophy all ideas of chance. Matter changes eternally its form, never its essence. You cannot conceive of anything being created. No one can conceive of anything existing without a cause, or with a cause. Let me explain. A thing is not a cause until an effect has been produced, so that, after all, cause and effect are twins, coming into life at precisely the same instant, born of the womb of an unknown mother. The universe is the only fact, and everything that ever has happened, is happening, or will happen, are but the different aspects of the one eternal fact.
This concludes our interview, Miracles and Immortality. Section 8 of Selected Interviews with Robert G. Ingersoll, Volume 1. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Prologue and interviewer's questions read by Michele Fry, Baton Rouge, Louisiana. Ingersoll's responses read by Edward Kirkby, Warwick, England. Interview title, Psychical Research and the Bible. Printed in Mind, New York, March 1899. As an incident in the life of anyone favored with the privilege, a visit to the home of Colonel Robert G. Ingersoll is certain to be recalled as a most pleasant and profitable experience. Although not a sympathizer with the great agnostic's religious views, yet I have long admired his ability, his humor, his intellectual honesty and courage. And it was with gratification that I accepted the good offices of a common friend who recently offered to introduce me to the Ingersoll domestic circle in Gramercy Park. Here I found the genial colonel, surrounded by his children, his grandchildren, and his amiable wife, whose smiling greeting dispelled formality and breathed welcome in every syllable. The family relationship seemed absolutely ideal, the very walls emitting an atmosphere of art and music, of contentment and companionship, of mutual trust, happiness, and generosity. But my chief desire was to elicit Colonel Ingersoll's personal views on questions related to the New Thought and its attitude on matters on which he is known to have very decided opinions. My request for a private chat was cordially granted. During the conversation that ensued, the substance of which is presented to the readers of Mind in the following paragraphs, with the Colonel's consent, I was impressed most deeply not by the force of his arguments, but by the sincerity of his convictions. Among some of his more violent opponents, who presumably lack other opportunities of becoming known, it is the fashion to accuse Ingersoll of having really no belief in his own opinions. But if he convinced me of little else, He certainly, without effort, satisfied my mind that this accusation is a slander. Utterly mistaken in his views he may be, but if so, his errors are more honest than many of those he points out in the King James Version of the Bible. If his pulpit enemies could talk with this man by his own fireside, they would pay less attention to Ingersoll himself and more to what he says. They would consider his meaning rather than his motive. As the Colonel is the most conspicuous denunciator of intolerance and bigotry in America, he has been inevitably the greatest victim of these obstacles to mental freedom. To answer Ingersoll is the pet ambition of many a young clergyman. The older ones have either acquired prudence or are broad enough to concede the utility of even agnostics in the economy of evolution. It was with the very subject that we began our talk, the uncharitableness of men, otherwise good, in their treatment of those whose religious views differ from their own. First question. What is your conception of true intellectual hospitality? As truth can brook no compromises, has it not the same limitations that surround social and domestic hospitality?
In the Republic of Mind, we are all equals. Each one is sceptred and crowned. Each one is the monarch of his own realm. By intellectual hospitality, I mean the right of everyone to think and to express his thought. It makes no difference whether his thought is right or wrong. If you are intellectually hospitable, you will admit the right of every human being to see for himself, to hear with his own ears, see with his own eyes, and think with his own brain. You will not try to change his thought by force, by persecution, or by slander. You will not threaten him with punishment here or hereafter. You will give him your thought, your reasons, your facts, and there you will stop. This is intellectual hospitality. You do not give up what you believe to be the truth. You do not compromise. You simply give him the liberty you claim for yourself. The truth is not affected by your opinion or by his. Both may be wrong. For many years the Church has claimed to have the truth, and has also insisted that it is the duty of every man to believe it, whether it is reasonable to him or not. This is bigotry in its basest form. Every man should be guided by his reason, should be true to himself, should preserve the veracity of his soul. Each human being should judge for himself. The man that believes that all men have this right is intellectually hospitable.
In the sharp distinction between theology and religion that is now recognized by many theologians, and in the liberalizing of the Church that has marked the last 2 decades, are not most of your contentions already granted? Is not the lake of fire and brimstone an obsolete issue?
There has been in the last few years a great advance. The orthodox creeds have been growing vulgar and cruel. Civilized people are shocked at the dogma of eternal pain, and the belief in hell has mostly faded away. The churches have not changed their creeds. They still pretend to believe as they always have, but they have changed their tone. God is now a father, a friend. He is no longer the monster, the savage, described in the Bible. He has become somewhat civilized. He no longer claims the right to damn us because he made us. But in spite of all the errors and contradictions, in spite of the cruelties and absurdities found in the Scriptures, the churches still insist that the Bible is inspired. The educated ministers admit that the Pentateuch was not written by Moses, that the Psalms were not written by David, that Isaiah was the work of at least 3. Daniel was not written until after the prophecies mentioned in that book had been fulfilled, that Ecclesiastes was not written until the 2nd century after Christ, that Solomon's Song was not written by Solomon, that the book of Esther is of no importance, and that no one knows or pretends to know who were the authors of Kings, Samuel, Chronicles, or Job, and yet these same gentlemen still cling to the dogma of inspiration. It is no longer claimed that the Bible is true, but inspired.
Yet the sacred volume, no matter who wrote it, is a mine of wealth to the student and the philosopher, is it not? Would you have us discard it altogether?
Inspiration must be abandoned, and the Bible must take its place among the books of the world. It contains some good passages, a little poetry, some good sense, and some kindness, but its philosophy is frightful. In fact, if the book had never existed, I think it would have been far better for mankind. It is not enough to give up the Bible. That is only the beginning. The supernatural must be given up. It must be admitted that nature has no master, that there never has been any interference from without, that man has received no help from heaven, and that all the prayers that have ever been uttered have died unanswered in the heedless air. The religion of the supernatural has been a curse. We want the religion of usefulness.
But have you no use whatever for prayer, even in the sense of aspiration, or for faith, in the sense of confidence in the ultimate triumph of the right?
There is a difference between wishing, hoping, believing, and knowing. We can wish without evidence or probability, and we can wish for the impossible, for what we believe can never be. We cannot hope unless there is in the mind a possibility that the thing hoped for can happen. We can believe only in accordance with evidence, and we know only that which has been demonstrated. I have no use for prayer, but I do a good deal of wishing and hoping. I hope that some time the right will triumph, the truth will gain the victory, but I have no faith in gaining the assistance of any God, or of any supernatural power. I never pray.
However fully materialism as a philosophy may accord with the merely human reason, is it not wholly antagonistic to the instinctive faculties of the mind?
Human reason is the final arbiter. Any system that does not commend itself to the reason must fall. I do not know exactly what you mean by materialism. I do not know what matter is. I am satisfied, however, that without matter there can be no force, no life, no thought, no reason. It seems to me that mind is a form of force, and force cannot exist apart from matter. If it is said that God created the universe, then there must have been a time when he commenced to create. If at that time there was nothing in existence but himself, how could he have exerted any force? Force cannot be exerted except in opposition to force. If God was the only existence, force could not have been exerted.
But don't you think, Colonel, that the materialistic philosophy, even in the light of your own interpretation, is essentially pessimistic?
I do not consider it so. I believe that the pessimists and the optimists are both right. This is the worst possible world, and this is the best possible world, because it is as it must be. The present is the child, and the necessary child of all the past.
What have you to say concerning the operations of the Society for Psychical Research? Do not its facts and conclusions prove, if not immortality, at least the continuity of life beyond the grave? Are the millions of spiritualists deluded?
Of course I have heard and read a great deal about the doings of the Society, so I have some knowledge as to what is claimed by spiritualists, by theosophists, and by all other believers in what are called spiritual manifestations. Thousands of wonderful things have been established by what is called evidence, the testimony of good men and women. I have seen things done that I could not explain, both by mediums and magicians. I also know that it is easy to deceive the senses, and that the old saying that seeing is believing is subject to many exceptions. I am perfectly satisfied that there is and can be no force without matter, that everything that is, all phenomena, all actions and thoughts, all exhibitions of force, have a material basis, that nothing exists, ever did, or ever will exist apart from matter. So I am satisfied that no matter ever existed or ever will apart from force. We think with the same force with which we walk. For every action and for every thought we draw upon the store of force that we have gained from air and food. We create no force, we borrow it all. As force cannot exist apart from matter, it must be used with matter. It travels only on material roads. It is impossible to convey a thought to another without the assistance of matter. No one can conceive of the use of one of our senses without substance. No one can conceive of a thought in the absence of the senses. With these conclusions in my mind, in my brain, I have not the slightest confidence in spiritual manifestations, and I do not believe that any message has ever been received from the dead. The testimony that I have heard, that I have read, coming even from men of science, has not the slightest weight with me. I do not pretend to see beyond the grave. I do not say that man is, or is not, immortal. All I say is that there is no evidence that we live again, and no demonstration that we do not. It is better ignorantly to hope than dishonestly to affirm.
And what do you think of the modern development of metaphysics, as expressed outside of the emotional and semi-ecclesiastical schools? I refer especially to the power of mind in the curing of disease, as demonstrated by scores of drugless healers.
I have no doubt that the condition of the mind has some effect upon the health. The blood, the heart, the lungs answer, respond to emotion. There is no mind without body, and the body is affected by thought, by passion, by cheerfulness, by depression. Still, I have not the slightest confidence in what is called mind cure. I do not believe that thought or any set of ideas can cure a cancer, or prevent the hair from falling out, or remove a tumor, or even freckles. At the same time, I admit that cheerfulness is good and depression bad. But I have no confidence in what you call drugless healers. If the stomach is sour, soda is better than thinking. If one is in great pain, opium will beat meditation. I am a believer in what you call drugs, and when I am sick, I send for a physician. I have no confidence in the supernatural. Magic is not medicine.
One great object of this movement is to make religion scientific, an aid to intellectual as well as spiritual progress. Is it not thus to be encouraged and destined to succeed, even though it prove the reality and supremacy of the spirit and the secondary importance of the flesh?
When religion becomes scientific, it ceases to be religion and becomes science. Religion is not intellectual, it is emotional. It does not appeal to the reason. The founder of a religion has always said, "Let him that hath ears to hear, hear." No founder has said, "Let him that hath brains to think, think." Besides, we need not trouble ourselves about spirit and flesh. We know that we know of no spirit without flesh. We have no evidence that spirit ever did or ever will exist apart from flesh. Such existence is absolutely inconceivable. If we are going to construct what you call a religion, it must be founded on observed and known facts. Theories to be of value must be in accord with all the facts that are known, otherwise they are worthless. We need not try to get back of facts or behind the truth. The why will forever elude us. You cannot move your hand quickly enough to grasp your image back of the mirror.
End of Psychical Research and the Bible. Section 9 of Selected Interviews with Robert G. Ingersoll, Volume 1. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Prologue and interviewer's questions read by Michele Fry, Baton Rouge, Louisiana. Ingersoll's responses read by Claudia Salto. Interview title, Blasphemy, printed in the Philadelphia Press, May 24, 1884. Quote, "If Robert G. Ingersoll indulges in blasphemy tonight in his lecture, as he has in other places and in this city before, he will be arrested before he leaves the city." End quote. So spoke Reverend Irwin H. Torrance, General Secretary of the Pennsylvania Bible Society, yesterday afternoon to a press reporter. Quote, "We have consulted counsel, the law is with us, and Ingersoll has but to do what he has done before, to find himself in a cell. Here is the act of March 31st, 1860. Quote, "If any person shall wilfully, premeditatedly, and despitefully blaspheme or speak loosely and profanely of Almighty God, Jesus Christ, the Holy Spirit, or the Scriptures of truth, such person, on conviction thereof, shall be sentenced to pay a fine not exceeding $100 and undergo an imprisonment not exceeding 3 months, or either at the discretion of the court." End quote. Last evening, Colonel Ingersoll sat in the dining room at Guy's Hotel, just in from New York City. When told of the plans of Mr. Torrance and his friends, he laughed and said, quote,
I did not suppose that anybody was idiotic enough to want me arrested for blasphemy. It seems to me that an infinite being can take care of himself without the aid of any agent of a Bible Society. Perhaps it is wrong for me to be here while the Methodist Conference is in session. Of course, no one who differs from the Methodist ministers should ever visit Philadelphia while they are here. I most humbly hope to be forgiven.
"What do you think of the law of 1860?
It is exceedingly foolish. Surely there is no need for the legislature of Pennsylvania to protect an infinite God. And why should the Bible be protected by law? The most ignorant priest can hold Darwin up to orthodox scorn. This talk of the Reverend Mr. Torrance shows that my lectures are needed, that religious people do not know what real liberty is. I presume that the law of 1860 is an old one re-enacted. It is a survival of ancient ignorance and bigotry, and no one in the legislature thought it worth while to fight it. It is the same as the law against swearing. Both are dead letters and amount to nothing. They are not enforced and should not be. Public opinion will regulate such matters. If all who take the name of God in vain were imprisoned, there would not be room in the jails to hold the ministers. They speak of God in the most flippant and snap-your-fingers way that can be conceived of. They speak to him as though he were an intimate chum, and metaphorically slap him on the back in the most familiar way possible.
Have you ever had any similar experiences before?
Oh, yes, threats have been made, but I was never arrested. When Mr. Torrance gets cool, he will see that he has made a mistake. People in Philadelphia have been in the habit of calling the citizens of Boston bigots, but there is more real freedom of thought and expression in Boston than in almost any other city of the world. I think that as I am to suffer in hell forever, Mr. Torrance ought to be satisfied and let me have a good time here. He can amuse himself through all eternity by seeing me in hell, and that ought to be enough to satisfy not only an agent, but the whole Bible Society. I never expected any trouble in this state, and most sincerely hope that Mr. Torrance will not trouble me and make the city a laughing-stock. Philadelphia has no time to waste in such foolish things. Let the Bible take its chances with other books. Let everybody feel that he has the right freely to express his opinions, provided he is decent and kind about it. Certainly the Christians now ought to treat infidels as well as Penn did Indians. Nothing could be more perfectly idiotic than in this day and generation to prosecute any man for giving his conclusions upon any religious subject. Mr. Torrens would have had Huxley and Haeckel and Tyndall arrested, would have had Humboldt and John Stuart Mill and Harriet Martineau and George Eliot locked up in the city jail. Mr. Torrens is a fossil from the old red sandstone of a mistake. Let him rest. To hear these people talk, you would suppose that God is some petty king, some Lilliputian prince, who was about to be dethroned and who was nearly wild for recruits.
But what would you do if they should make an attempt to arrest you?
Nothing, except to defend myself in court.
End of blasphemy. Section 10 of Selected Interviews with Robert G. Ingersoll, Volume 1. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Prologue and Ingersoll's voice read by Edward Kirkby, Warwick, England. Interviewer's questions read by Michele Fry, Baton Rouge, Louisiana. Interview title, This Century's Glories. Published in The Sun, New York, March 19, 1899.
The laurel of the 19th century is on Darwin's brow. This century has been the greatest of all. The inventions, the discoveries, the victories on the fields of thought, the advances in nearly every direction of human effort are without parallel in human history. In only two directions have the achievements of this century been excelled. The marbles of Greece have not been equalled. They still occupy the niches dedicated to perfection. The sculptors of our century stand before the miracles of the Greeks in impotent wonder. They cannot even copy. They cannot give the breath of life to stone and make the marble feel and think. The plays of Shakespeare have never been approached. He reached the summit, filled the horizon. In the direction of the dramatic, the poetic, the human mind, in my judgment, in Shakespeare's plays, reached its limit. The field was harvested, all the secrets of the heart were told, the buds of all hopes blossomed, all seas were crossed, and all the shores were touched. With these two exceptions, the Grecian marbles and the Shakespeare plays, the 19th century has produced more for the benefit of man than all the centuries of the past. In this century, in one direction, I think the mind has reached the limit. I do not believe the music of Wagner will ever be excelled. He changed all passions, longing, memories, and aspirations into tones, and with subtle harmonies wove tapestries of sound, whereon were pictured the past and future, the history and prophecy of the human heart. Of course Copernicus, Galileo, Newton, and Kepler laid the foundations of astronomy. It may be that the three laws of Kepler mark the highest point in that direction that the mind has reached. In the other centuries there is now and then a peak, but through ours there runs a mountain range, with Alp on Alp, the steamship that has conquered all the seas, the railway, with its steeds of steel with breath of flame, covers the land. The cables and telegraphs, along which lightning is the carrier of thought, have made the nations neighbours and brought the world to every home. The making of paper from wood, the printing presses that made it possible to give the history of the human race each day, the reapers, mowers, and threshers that superseded the cradles, scythes, and flails, the lighting of streets and houses with gas and incandescent lamps, changing night into day, the invention of matches that made fire the companion of man, the process of making steel invented by Bessemer, saving for the world hundreds of millions a year, the discovery of anesthetics, changing pain to happy dreams, and making surgery a science, the spectrum analysis that told us the secrets of the suns, the telephone that transports speech, uniting lips and ears, the phonograph that holds in dots and marks the echoes of our words, the marvelous machines that spin and weave, that manufacture the countless things of use, the marvelous machines whose wheels and levers seem to think, the discoveries in chemistry, the wave theory of light, the indestructibility of matter and force, the discovery of microbes and bacilli, so that now the plague can be stayed without the assistance of priests. The art of photography became known. The sun became an artist, gave us the faces of our friends, copies of the great paintings and statues, pictures of the world's wonders, and enriched the eyes of poverty with the spoil of travel, the wealth of art. The cell theory was advanced, embryology was studied, and science entered the secret house of life. The biologists, guided by fossil forms, followed the paths of life from protoplasm up to man. Then came Darwin, with the origin of species, natural selection, and the survival of the fittest. From his brain there came a flood of light. The old theories grew foolish and absurd. The temple of every science was rebuilt. That which had been called philosophy became childish superstition. The prison doors were opened, and millions of convicts, of unconscious slaves, roved with joy over the fenceless fields of freedom. Darwin and Haeckel and Huxley and their fellow workers filled the night of ignorance with the glittering stars of truth. This is Darwin's victory. He gained the greatest victory, the grandest triumph. The laurel of the 19th century is on his brow.
How does the literature of today compare with that of the first half of the century, in your opinion?
There is now no poet of laughter and tears, of comedy and pathos, the equal of Hood. There is none with the subtle delicacy, the aerial footstep, the flame-like motion of Shelley, none with the amplitude, sweep, and passion, with the strength and beauty, the courage and royal recklessness of Byron. The novelists of our day are not the equals of Dickens. In my judgment, Dickens wrote the greatest of all novels. The Tale of Two Cities is the supreme work of fiction. Its philosophy is perfect. The characters stand out like living statues. In its pages you find the blood and flame, the ferocity and self-sacrifice of the French Revolution. In the bosom of the vengeance is the heart of the horror. In 105, North Tower sits one whom sorrow drove beyond the verge, rescued from death by insanity, and we see the spirit of Dr. Manette trembling across the great gulf that lies between the night of dreams and the blessed day, where things are as they seem, as a tress of golden hair, while on his hands and cheeks fall Lucie's blessed tears. The story is filled with lights and shadows, with the tragic and grotesque. While the woman knits, while the heads fall, Jerry Cruncher gnaws his rusty nails, and his poor wife flops against his business, and prim Miss Prose, who, in the desperation and terror of love, held Mademoiselle Defarge in her arms, and who, in the flash and crash, found that her burden was dead, is drawn by the hand of a master. And what shall I say of Sidney Carton, of his last walk, of his last ride, holding the poor girl by the hand? Is there a more wonderful character in all the realm of fiction? Sidney Carton, the perfect lover, going to his death for the love of one who loves another. To me the three greatest novels are The Tale of Two Cities by Dickens, Les Miserables by Hugo, and Ariadne by Ouida. Les Miserables is full of faults and perfections. The tragic is sometimes pushed to the grotesque, but from the depths it brings the pearls of truth. A convict becomes holier than the saint, a prostitute purer than the nun. This book fills the gutter with the glory of heaven, while the waters of the sewer reflect the stars. In Ariadne you find the aroma of all art. It is a classic dream, and there too you find that hot blood of full and ample life. Ouida is the greatest living writer of fiction. Some of her books I do not like. If you wish to know what Ouida really is, read Wanda, The Dog of Flanders, The Leaf in a Storm. In these you will hear the beating of her heart. Most of the novelists of our time write good stories. They are ingenious. The characters are well drawn, but they lack life, energy. They do not appear to act for themselves, impelled by inner force. They seem to be pushed and pulled. The same may be said of the poets. Tennyson belongs to the latter half of our century. He was undoubtedly a great writer. He had no flame or storm, no tidal wave, nothing volcanic. He never overflowed the banks. He wrote nothing as intense, as noble and pathetic as The Prisoner of Chillon, nothing as purely poetic as The Skylark, nothing as perfect as The Grecian Urn, and yet he was one of the greatest of poets. Viewed from all sides, he was far greater than Shelley, far nobler than Keats. In a few poems Shelley reached almost the perfect, but many are weak, feeble, fragmentary, almost meaningless. So Keats in 3 poems reached a great height, in St. Agnes' Eve, The Grecian Urn, and The Nightingale, but most of his poetry is insipid, without thought, beauty, or sincerity. We have had some poets ourselves. Emerson wrote many poetic and philosophic lines. He never violated any rule. He kept his passions under control and generally kept off the grass. But he uttered some great and splendid truths and sowed countless seeds of suggestion. When we remember that he came of a line of New England preachers, we are amazed at the breadth, the depth, and the freedom of his thought. Walt Whitman wrote a few great poems, elemental, natural poems that seem to be a part of nature, ample as the sky, having the rhythm of the tides, the swing of a planet. Whitcomb Riley has written poems of hearth and home, of love and labour, worthy of Robert Burns. He is the sweetest, strongest singer in our country, and I do not know his equal in any land. But when we compare the literature of the first half of this century with that of the last, we are compelled to say that the last, taken as a whole, is best. Think of the volumes that science has given to the world. In the first half of this century, sermons, orthodox sermons, were published and read. Now reading sermons is one of the lost habits. Taken as a whole, the literature of the latter half of our century is better than the first. I like the essays of Professor Clifford. They are so clear, so logical, that they are poetic. Herbert Spencer is not simply instructive. He is charming. He is full of true imagination. He is not the slave of imagination. Imagination is his servant. Huxley wrote like a trained swordsman. His thrusts were never parried. He had superb courage. He never apologized for having an opinion. There was never on his soul the stain of evasion. He was as candid as the truth. Haeckel is a great writer because he reveres a fact and would not for his life deny or misinterpret one. He tells what he knows with the candor of a child and defends his conclusions like a scientist, a philosopher. He stands next to Darwin. Coming back to fiction and poetry, I have great admiration for Edgar Fawcett. There is in his poetry thought, beauty, and philosophy. He has the courage of his thought. He knows our language, the energy of verbs, the color of adjectives. He is, in the highest sense, an artist.
What do you think of Hall Caine's recent efforts to bring about a closer union between the stage and pulpit?
Of course, I'm not certain as to the intentions of Mr. Caine. I saw the Christian, and it did not seem to me that the author was trying to catch the clergy. There is certainly nothing in the play calculated to please the pulpit. There is a clergyman who is pious and heartless. John Storm is the only Christian, and he is crazy. When Glory accepts him at last, you not only feel, but you know she has acted the fool. The lord in the piece is a dog, and the real gentleman is the chap that runs the music hall. How the play can please the pulpit I do not see. Storm's whole career is a failure. His followers turn on him like wild beasts. His religion is a divine and diabolical dream. With him, murder is one of the means of salvation. Mr. Caine has struck Christianity a stinging blow between the eyes. He has put two preachers on the stage, one a heartless hypocrite and the other a madman. Certainly I am not prejudiced in favor of Christianity, and yet I enjoyed the play. If Mr. Caine says he is trying to bring the stage and the pulpit together, then he is a humorist, with the humor of Rabelais.
What do recent exhibitions in this city of scenes from the life of Christ indicate with regard to the tendencies of modern art?
Nothing. Some artists love the sombre, the melancholy, the hopeless. They enjoy painting the bowed form, the tear-filled eyes. To them grief is a festival. There are people who find pleasure in funerals. They love to watch the mourners, the falling clods make music. They love the silence, the heavy odours, the sorrowful hymns, and the preacher's remarks. The feelings of such people do not indicate the general trend of the human mind. Even a poor artist may hope for success if he represents something in which many millions are deeply interested, around which their emotions cling like vines. A man need not be an orator to make a patriotic speech, a speech that flatters his audience. So an artist need not be great in order to satisfy, if his subject appeals to the prejudice of those who look at his pictures. I have never seen a good painting of Christ. All the Christ that I have seen lack strength and character. They look weak and despairing. They are all unhealthy. They have the attitude of apology, the sickly smile of non-resistance. I have never seen an heroic, serene, and triumphant Christ. To tell the truth, I never saw a great religious picture. They lack sincerity. All the angels look almost idiotic. In their eyes is no thought, only the innocence of ignorance. I think that art is leaving the celestial, the angelic, and is getting in love with the natural, the human. Troyan put more genius into the representation of cattle than Angelo and Raphael did in angels. No picture has been painted of heaven that is as beautiful as a landscape by Corot. The aim of art is to represent the realities, the highest and noblest, the most beautiful. The Greeks did not try to make men like gods, but they made gods like men, so that great artists of our day go to nature.
Is it not strange that, with one exception, the most notable operas written since Wagner are by Italian composers instead of German?
For many years, German musicians insisted that Wagner was not a composer. They declared that he produced only a succession of discordant noises. I account for this by the fact that the music of Wagner was not German. His countrymen could not understand it. They had to be educated. There was no orchestra in Germany that could really play Tristan and Isolde. Its eloquence, its pathos, its shoreless passion was beyond them. There is no reason to suppose that Germany is to produce another Wagner. Is England expected to give us another Shakespeare?
End of this century's glories. Section 11 of Selected Interviews with Robert G. Ingersoll, Volume 1. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Interviewers' questions read by Michele Fry, Baton Rouge, Louisiana. Ingersoll's responses read by Claudia Salto. Interview title, Divorce. Printed in The Herald, New York, February 1897. First question. The Herald would like to have you give your ideas on divorce. On last Sunday in your lecture, you said a few words on the subject, but only a few. Do you think the laws governing divorce ought to be changed? Ingersoll's answer.
We obtained our ideas about divorce from the Hebrews, from the New Testament and the Church. In the Old Testament, woman is not considered of much importance. The wife was the property of the husband. Thou shalt not covet thy neighbor's ox or his wife. In this commandment the wife is put on an equality with other property, so under certain conditions the husband could put away his wife, but the wife could not put away her husband. In the New Testament there is little in favor of marriage, and really nothing as to the rights of wives. Christ said nothing in favor of marriage, and never married. So far as I know, none of the apostles had families. St. Paul was opposed to marriage, and allowed it only as a choice of evils. In those days it was imagined by the Christians that the world was about to be purified by fire, and that they would be changed into angels. The early Christians were opposed to marriage, and the fathers looked upon woman as the source of all evil. They did not believe in divorces. They thought that if people loved each other better than they did God and got married, they ought to be held to the bargain, no matter what happened. These fathers were, for the most part, ignorant and hateful savages, and had no more idea of right and wrong than wild beasts. The Church insisted that marriage was a sacrament, and that God, in some mysterious way, joined husband and wife in marriage, that He was one of the parties to the contract, and that only death could end it. Of course, this supernatural view of marriage is perfectly absurd. If there be a God, there certainly have been marriages He did not approve, and certain it is that God can have no interest in keeping husbands and wives together who never should have married. Some of the preachers insist that God instituted marriage in the Garden of Eden. We now know that there was no Garden of Eden, and that woman was not made from the first man's rib. Nobody with any real sense believes this now. The institution of marriage was not established by Jehovah, neither was it established by Christ, not any of his apostles. In considering the question of divorce, the supernatural should be discarded. We should take into consideration only the effect upon human beings. The gods should be allowed to take care of themselves. Is it to the interest of a husband and wife to live together after love has perished, and when they hate each other? Will this add to their happiness? Should a woman be compelled to remain the wife of a man who hates and abuses her, and whom she loathes? Has society any interest in forcing women to live with the men they hate? There is no real marriage without love, and in the marriage state there is no morality without love. A woman who remains the wife of a man whom she despises or does not love corrupts her soul. She becomes degraded, polluted, and feels that her flesh has been soiled. Under such circumstances a good woman suffers the agonies of moral death. It may be said that the woman can leave her husband, that she is not compelled to live in the same house or to occupy the same room. If she has the right to leave, has she the right to get a new house? Should a woman be punished for having married? Women do not marry the wrong man on purpose. Thousands of mistakes are made. Are these mistakes sacred? Must they be preserved to please God? What good can it do God to keep people married who hate each other? What good can it do the community to keep such people together?
Do you consider marriage a contract or a sacrament?
Marriage is the most important contract that human beings can make. No matter whether it is called a contract or a sacrament, it remains the same. A true marriage is a natural concord or agreement of souls, a harmony in which discord is not even imagined. It is a mingling so perfect that only one seems to exist. All other considerations are lost. The present seems eternal. In this supreme moment there is no shadow, or the shadow is as luminous as light. When two beings thus love, thus united, this is the true marriage of soul and soul. The idea of contract is lost. Duty and obligation are instantly changed into desire and joy, and two lives, like uniting streams, flow on as one. This is real marriage. Now, if the man turns out to be a wild beast, if he destroys the happiness of the wife, why should she remain his victim? If she wants a divorce, she should have it. The divorce will not hurt God or the community. As a matter of fact, it will save a life. No man not poisoned by superstition will object to the release of an abused wife. In such a case, only savages can object to divorce. The man who wants courts and legislatures to force a woman to live with him is a monster.
Do you believe that the divorced should be allowed to marry again?
Certainly. Has the woman whose rights have been outraged no right to build another home? Must this woman, full of kindness, affection, and health, be chained until death releases her? Is there no future for her? Must she be an outcast forever? Can she never sit by her own hearth, with the arms of her children about her neck, and by her side a husband who loves and protects her? There are no two sides to this question. All human beings should be allowed to correct their mistakes. If the wife has flagrantly violated the contract of marriage, the husband should be given a divorce. If the wife wants a divorce, if she loathes her husband, if she no longer loves him, then the divorce should be granted. It is immoral for a woman to live as the wife of a man whom she abhors. The home should be pure. Children should be well born. Their parents should love one another. Marriages are made by men and women, not by society, not by the state, not by the church, not by the gods. Nothing is moral that does not tend to the well-being of sentient beings. The good home is the unit of good government. The hearthstone is the cornerstone of civilization. Society is not interested in the preservation of hateful homes. It is not to the interest of society that good women should be enslaved, or that they should become mothers by husbands whom they hate. Most of the laws about divorce are absurd or cruel and ought to be repealed.
End of divorce. Section 12 of Selected Interviews with Robert G. Ingersoll, Volume 1. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Interviewer's questions read by Michele Fry, Baton Rouge, Louisiana. Ingersoll's responses read by Claudia Salto. Interview title, The Sunday Laws of Pittsburgh. Published in The Leader, Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, October 27, 1879. First question. Colonel, what do you think of the course the mayor has pursued toward you in attempting to stop your lecture? Ingersoll's answer.
I know very little, except what I have seen in the morning paper. As a general rule, laws should be enforced or repealed, and so far as I am personally concerned, I shall not so much complain of the enforcing of the law against Sabbath breaking as of the fact that such a law exists. We have fallen heir to these laws. They were passed by superstition, and the enlightened people of today should repeal them. Ministers should not expect to fill their churches by shutting up other places. They can only increase their congregations by improving their sermons. They will have more hearers when they say more worth hearing. I have no idea that the mayor has any prejudice against me personally, and if he only enforces the law, I shall have none against him. If my lectures were free, the ministers might have the right to object, but as I charge $1 admission and they nothing, they ought certainly be able to compete with me.
Don't you think it is the duty of the mayor, as chief executive of the city laws, to enforce the ordinances and to pay no attention to what the statutes say?
I suppose it to be the duty of the mayor to enforce the ordinance of the city, and if the ordinance of the city covers the same ground as the law of the state, a conviction under the ordinance would be a bar to prosecution under the state law.
If the ordinance exempts scientific, literary, and historical lectures, as it says it does, will not that exempt you?
Yes, all my lectures are historical. That is, I speak of many things that have happened. They are scientific because they are filled with facts, and they are literary, of course. I can conceive of no address that is neither historical nor scientific, except sermons. They fail to be historical because they treat of things that never happened, and they are certainly not scientific, as they contain no facts.
Suppose they arrest you, what will you do?
I will examine the law, and if convicted, will pay the fine, unless I think I can reverse the case by appeal. Of course, I would like to see all these foolish laws wiped from the statute books. I want the law so that everybody can do just as he pleases on Sunday, provided he does not interfere with the rights of others. I want the Christian, the Jew, the deist, and the atheist to be exactly equal before the law. I would fight for the right of the Christian to worship God in his own way just as quick as I would for the atheist to enjoy music, flowers, and fields. I hope to see the time when even the poor people can hear the music of the finest operas on Sunday. One grand opera with all its thrilling tones will do more good in touching and elevating the world than 10,000 sermons on the agonies of hell.
Have you ever been interfered with before in delivering Sunday lectures?
No, I postponed a lecture in Baltimore at the request of the owners of the theatre because they were afraid some action might be taken. That is the only case. I have delivered lectures on Sunday in the principal cities of the United States, in New York, Boston, Buffalo, Chicago, San Francisco, Cincinnati, and many other places. I lectured here last winter. It was on Sunday, and I heard nothing of its being contrary to law. I always supposed my lectures were good enough to be delivered on the most sacred days.
End of the Sunday Laws of Pittsburgh. Footnote: the manager of the theater where Colonel Ingersoll lectured was fined $50, which Colonel Ingersoll paid. Section 13 of Selected Interviews with Robert G. Ingersoll, Volume 1. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Interviewer's questions read by Michele Fry, Baton Rouge, Louisiana. Ingersoll's responses read by Edward Kirkby, Warwick, England. Interviewed title: The Oath Question. Printed in the Secular Review, London, England, 1884. First question: I suppose that your attention has been called to the excitement in England over the oath question, and you have probably wondered that so much should have been made of so little.
Yes, I have read a few articles upon the subject, including one by Cardinal Newman. It is wonderful that so many people imagine that there is something miraculous in the oath. They seem to regard it as a kind of verbal fetish, a charm, an open sesame to be pronounced at the door of truth, a spell, a kind of moral thumbscrew, by means of which falsehood itself is compelled to turn informer. The oath has outlived its brother, the wager of battle. Both were born of the idea that God would interfere for the right and for the truth. Trial by fire and by water had the same origin. It was once believed that the man in the wrong could not kill the man in the right, but experience having shown that he usually did, the belief gradually fell into disrepute. So it was once thought that a perjurer could not swallow a piece of sacramental bread, but the fear that made the swallowing difficult having passed away, the appeal to the corsned was abolished. It was found that a brazen or a desperate man could eat himself out of the greatest difficulty with perfect ease, satisfying the law and his own hunger at the same time. The oath is a relic of barbarous theology, of the belief that a personal God interferes in the affairs of men, that some God protects innocence and guards the right. The experience of the world has sadly demonstrated the folly of that belief. The testimony of a witness ought to be believed, not because it is given under the solemnities of an oath, but because it is reasonable. If unreasonable, it ought to be thrown aside. The question ought not to be, has this been sworn to, but is this true? The moment evidence is tested by the standard of reason, the oath becomes a useless ceremony. Let the man who gives false evidence be punished as the law-making power may prescribe. He should be punished because he commits a crime against society, and he should be punished in this world. All honest men will tell the truth if they can, therefore oaths will have no effect upon them. Dishonest men will not tell the truth unless the truth happens to suit their purpose, therefore oaths will have no effect upon them. We punish them not for swearing to a lie, but for telling it, and we can make the punishment for telling the falsehood just as severe as we wish. If they are to be punished in another world, the probability is that the punishment there will be for having told the falsehood here. After all, a lie is made no worse by an oath, and the truth is made no better.
You object then to the oath. Is your objection based on any religious grounds or on any prejudice against the ceremony because of its religious origin? Or what is your objection?
I care nothing about the origin of the ceremony. The objection to the oath is this: it furnishes a falsehood with a letter of credit. It supplies the wolf with sheep's clothing and covers the hands of Jacob with hair. It blows out the light, and in the darkness Leah is taken for Rachel. It puts upon each witness a kind of theological gown. This gown hides the moral rags of the depraved wretch as well as the virtues of the honest man. The oath is a mask that falsehood puts on, and for a moment is mistaken for truth. It gives to dishonesty the advantage of solemnity. The tendency of the oath is to put all testimony on an equality. The obscure rascal and the man of sterling character both swear, and jurors who attribute a miraculous quality to the oath forget the real difference in the men, and give about the same weight to the evidence of each, because both were sworn. A scoundrel is delighted with the opportunity of going through a ceremony that gives importance and dignity to his story, that clothes him for the moment with respectability, loans him the appearance of conscience, and gives the ring of true coin to the base metal. To him the oath is a shield. He is in partnership for a moment with God, and people who have no confidence in the witness credit the firm.
Of course, you know that religionists insist that people are more likely to tell the truth when sworn, and that to take away the oath is to destroy the foundation of testimony.
If the use of the oath is defended on the ground that religious people need a stimulus to tell the truth, then I am compelled to say that religious people have been so badly educated that they mistake the nature of the crime. They should be taught that to defeat justice by falsehood is the real offence. Besides, fear is not the natural foundation of virtue. Even with religious people, fear cannot always last. Ananias and Sapphira have been dead so long, and since their time so many people have sworn falsely without affecting their health, that the fear of sudden divine vengeance no longer pales the cheek of the perjurer. If the vengeance is not sudden, then according to the Church the criminal will have plenty of time to repent, so that the oath no longer affects even the fearful. Would it not be better for the Church to teach that telling the falsehood is the real crime, and that taking the oath neither adds nor takes from its enormity? Would it not be better to teach that he who does wrong must suffer the consequences, whether God forgives him or not? He who tries to injure another may or may not succeed, but he cannot by any possibility fail to injure himself. Men should be taught that there is no difference between truth-telling and truth-swearing. Nothing is more vicious than the idea that any ceremony or form of words, hand-lifting or book-kissing, can add, even in the slightest degree, to the perpetual obligation every human being is under to speak the truth. The truth plainly told naturally commends itself to the intelligent. Every fact is a genuine link in the infinite chain, and will agree perfectly with every other fact. A fact asks to be inspected, asks to be understood. It needs no oath, no ceremony, no supernatural aid. It is independent of all the gods. A falsehood goes in partnership with theology and depends on the partner for success. To show how little influence for good has been attributed to the oath, it is only necessary to say that for centuries in the Christian world no person was allowed to testify who had the slightest pecuniary interest in the result of a suit. The expectation of a farthing in this world was supposed to outweigh the fear of God's wrath in the next. All the pangs, pains, and penalties of perdition were considered as nothing when compared with pounds, shillings, and pence in this world.
You know that in nearly all deliberative bodies, in parliaments and congresses, an oath or an affirmation is required to support what is called the Constitution, and that all officers are required to swear or affirm that they will discharge their duties. Do these oaths and affirmations, in your judgment, do any good?
Men have sought to make nations and institutions immortal by oaths. Subjects have sworn to obey kings, and kings have sworn to protect subjects, and yet the subjects have sometimes beheaded a king, and the king has often plundered the subjects. The oaths enable them to deceive each other. Every absurdity in religion and all tyrannical institutions have been patched, buttressed, and reinforced by oaths, and yet the history of the world shows the utter futility of putting in the coffin of an oath the political and religious aspirations of the race. Revolutions and reformations care little for "so help me God." Oaths have riveted shackles and sanctified abuses. People swear to support a constitution, and they will keep the oath as long as the constitution supports them. In 1776 the colonists cared nothing for the fact that they had sworn to support the British Crown. All the oaths to defend the Constitution of the United States did not prevent the Civil War. We have at last learned that states may be kept together for a little time by force, permanently only by mutual interest. We have found that the Delilah of superstition cannot bind with oaths the secular Samson. Why should a member of Parliament or of Congress swear to maintain the Constitution? If he is a dishonest man, the oath will have no effect. If he is an honest patriot, it will have no effect. In both cases it is equally useless. If a member fails to support the Constitution, the probability is that his constituents will treat him as he does the Constitution. In this country, after all, the members of Congress have sworn or affirmed to defend the Constitution. Each political party charges the other with a deliberate endeavour to destroy that sacred instrument. Possibly the political oath was invented to prevent the free and natural development of a nation. Kings and nobles and priests wished to retain the property they had filched and clutched. For that purpose they compelled the real owners to swear that they would support and defend the law under colour of which the theft and robbery had been accomplished. So in the Church, creeds have been protected by oaths. Priests and laymen solemnly swore that they would, under no circumstances, resort to reason, that they would overcome facts by faith and strike down demonstrations with the sword of the Spirit. Professors of the Theological Seminary at Andover, Massachusetts, swear to defend certain dogmas and to attack others. They swear sacredly to keep and guard the ignorance they have. With them, philosophy leads to perjury, and reason is the road to crime. While theological professors are not likely to make an intellectual discovery, still it is unwise, by taking an oath, to render that certain which is only improbable. If all witnesses sworn to tell the truth did so, if all the members of Parliament and of Congress in taking the oath became intelligent, patriotic, and honest, I should be in favour of retaining the ceremony. But we find that men who have taken the same oath advocate opposite ideas and entertain different opinions as to the meaning of the constitutions and laws. The oath adds nothing to their intelligence, does not even tend to increase their patriotism, and certainly does not make the dishonest honest.
Are not persons allowed to testify in the United States, whether they believe in future rewards and punishments or not?
In this country, in most of the states, witnesses are allowed to testify whether they believe in perdition and paradise or not. In some states they are allowed to testify even if they deny the existence of God. We have found that religious belief does not compel people to tell the truth, and then an utter denial of every Christian creed does not even tend to make them dishonest. You see, a religious belief does not affect the senses. Justice should not shut any door that leads to truth. No one will pretend that because you do not believe in hell, your sight is impaired, or your hearing dulled, or your memory rendered less retentive. A witness in a court is called upon to tell what he has seen, what he has heard, what he remembers, not what he believes about gods and devils and hells and heavens. A witness substantiates not a faith, but a fact. In order to ascertain whether a witness will tell the truth, you might with equal propriety examine him as to his ideas about music, painting, or architecture, as theology. A man may have no ear for music, and yet remember what he hears. He may care nothing about painting, and yet is able to tell what he sees. So he may deny every creed, and yet be able to tell the facts as he remembers them. Thomas Jefferson was wise enough so to frame the Constitution of Virginia that no person could be deprived of any civil right on account of his religious or irreligious belief. Through the influence of men like Paine, Franklin, and Jefferson, it was provided in the federal Constitution that officers elected under its authority could swear or affirm. This was the natural result of the separation of church and state.
I see that your presidents and governors issue their proclamations calling on the people to assemble in their churches and offer thanks to God. How does this happen in a government where church and state are not united?
Jefferson, when president, refused to issue what is known as the Thanksgiving Proclamation on the ground that the federal government had no right to interfere in religious matters, that the people owed no religious duties to the government, that the government derived its powers not from priests or gods, but from the people, and was responsible alone to the source of its power. The truth is, the framers of our Constitution intended that the government should be secular in the broadest and best sense, and yet there are thousands and thousands of religious people in this country who are greatly scandalized because there is no recognition of God in the federal Constitution. And for several years a great many ministers have been endeavoring to have the Constitution amended so as to recognize the existence of God and the divinity of Christ. A man by the name of Pollock was once superintendent of the Mint of Philadelphia. He was almost insane about having God in the Constitution. Failing in that, he got the inscription on our money, "In God We Trust." As our silver dollar is now in fact worth only 85 cents, it is claimed that the inscription means that we trust in God for the other 15 cents. There is a constant effort on the part of many Christians to have their religion in some way recognized by law. Proclamations are now issued calling upon the people to give thanks and directing attention to the fact that, while God has scourged or neglected other nations, he has been remarkably attentive to the wants and wishes of the United States. Governors of states issue these documents written in a tone of pious insincerity. The year may or may not have been prosperous, yet the degree of thankfulness called for is always precisely the same. A few years ago, the governor of Iowa issued an exceedingly rhetorical proclamation in which the people were requested to thank God for the unparalleled blessings he had showered upon them. A private citizen, fearing that the Lord might be misled by the official correspondence, issued his proclamation, in which he recounted with great particularity the hardships of the preceding year. He insisted that the weather had been of the poorest quality, that the spring came late and the frost early, that the people were in debt, that the farms were mortgaged, that the merchants were bankrupt, and that everything was in the worst possible condition. He concluded by sincerely hoping that the Lord would pay no attention to the proclamation of the governor, but would, if he had any doubt on the subject, come down and examine the state for himself. These proclamations have always appeared to me absurdly egotistical. Why should God treat us any better than he does the rest of his children? Why should he send pestilence and famine to China and health and plenty to us? Why give us corn and Egypt cholera? All these proclamations grow out of egotism and selfishness, of ignorance and superstition, and are based upon the idea that God is a capricious monster, that he loves flattery, that he can be coaxed and cajoled. The conclusion of the whole matter with me is this. For truth in courts we must depend upon the trained intelligence of judges, the right of cross-examination, the honesty and common sense of jurors, and upon an enlightened public opinion. As for members of Congress, we will trust to the wisdom and patriotism not only of the members, but of their constituents. In religion we will give to all the luxury of absolute liberty. The alchemist did not succeed in finding any stone the touch of which transmuted baser things to gold, and priests have not invented yet an oath with power to force from falsehood's desperate lips the pearl of truth.
End of the oath question. Section 14 of Selected Interviews with Robert G. Ingersoll, Volume 1. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Prologue and Interviewer's Questions, read by Michele Fry, Baton Rouge, Louisiana. Ingersoll's and Beecher's responses, read by Edward Kirkby, Warwick, England. Interview title, Ingersoll and Beecher, printed in the New York Herald, November 7, 1880. The sensation created by the speech of the Reverend Henry Ward Beecher at the Academy of Music in Brooklyn, when he uttered the brilliant eulogy of Colonel Robert Ingersoll and publicly shook hands with him, has not yet subsided. A portion of the religious world is thoroughly stirred up at what it considers a gross breach of orthodox propriety. This feeling is especially strong among the class of positivists who believe that, quote, an atheist's laugh is a poor exchange for deity offended, end quote. Many believe that Mr. Beecher is at heart in full sympathy and accord with Ingersoll's teachings, but has not courage enough to say so at the sacrifice of his pastoral position. The fact that these two men are at the very head and front of their respective schools of thought makes the matter an important one. The denouncement of the doctrine of eternal punishment, followed by the scene at the Academy, has about it an aroma of suggestiveness that might work much harm without an explanation. Since Colonel Ingersoll's recent attack upon the personnel of the clergy through the Shorter Catechism, the pulpit has been remarkably silent regarding the great atheist. Is the keen logic and broad humanity of Ingersoll converting the brain and heart of Christendom? Was recently asked. Did the hand that was stretched out to him on the stage of the Academy reach across the chasm which separates orthodoxy from infidelity? Desiring to answer the last question if possible, a Herald reporter visited Mr. Beecher and Colonel Ingersoll to learn their opinion of each other. Neither of the gentlemen was aware that the other was being interviewed. Questions to Ingersoll on Beecher. What is your opinion of Mr. Beecher?
I regard him as the greatest man in any pulpit of the world. He treated me with a generosity that nothing can exceed. He rose grandly above the prejudices supposed to belong to his class, and acted as only a man could act without a chain upon his brain and only kindness in his heart. I told him that night that I congratulated the world that it had a minister with an intellectual horizon broad enough and a mental sky studded with stars of genius enough to hold all creeds in scorn that shocked the heart of man. I think that Mr. Beecher has liberalized the English-speaking people of the world. I do not think he agrees with me. He holds to many things that I most passionately deny, but in common we believe in the liberty of thought. My principal objections to orthodox religion are two: slavery here and hell hereafter. I do not believe that Mr. Beecher on these points can disagree with me. The real difference between us is, he says God, I say nature. The real agreement between us is we both say liberty.
What is his forte?
He is of a wonderfully poetic temperament. In pursuing any course of thought his mind is like a stream flowing through the scenery of fairyland. The stream murmurs and laughs while the banks grow green and the vines blossom. His brain is controlled by his heart. He thinks in pictures. With him logic means mental melody. The discordant is the absurd. For years he has endeavored to hide the dungeon of orthodoxy with the ivy of imagination. Now and then he pulls for a moment the leafy curtain aside and is horrified to see the lizards, snakes, basilisks, and abnormal monsters of the orthodox age. and then he utters a great cry, the protest of a loving, throbbing heart. He is a great thinker, a marvellous orator, and, in my judgment, greater and grander than any creed of any church. Besides all this, he treated me like a king. Manhood is his forte, and I expect to live and die his friend.
Questions to Beecher on Ingersoll. What is your opinion of Colonel Ingersoll?
I do not think there should be any misconception as to my motive for endorsing Mr. Ingersoll. I never saw him before that night, when I clasped his hand in the presence of an assemblage of citizens, yet I regard him as one of the greatest men of this age.
Is his influence upon the world good or otherwise?
I am an ordained clergyman, and believe in revealed religion. I am therefore bound to regard all persons who do not believe in revealed religion as in error. But on the broad platform of human liberty and progress I was bound to give him the right hand of fellowship. I would do it 1,000 times over. I do not know Colonel Ingersoll's religious views precisely, but I have a general knowledge of them. He has the same right to free thought and free speech that I have. I am not that kind of a coward who has to kick a man before he shakes hands with him. If I did so, I would have to kick the Methodists, Roman Catholics, and all other creeds. I will not pitch into any man's religion as an excuse for giving him my hand. I admire Ingersoll because he is not afraid to speak what he honestly thinks, and I am only sorry that he does not think as I do. I never heard so much brilliancy and pith put into a 2-hour speech as I did on that night. I wish my whole congregation had been there to hear it. I regret that there are not more men like Ingersoll interested in the affairs of the nation. I do not wish to be understood as endorsing skepticism in any form.
End of Ingersoll and Beecher. Section 15 of Selected Interviews with Robert G. Ingersoll, Volume 1. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Interviewers' questions read by Michele Fry, Baton Rouge, Louisiana. Ingersoll's responses read by Claudia Salto. Interview title, District Suffrage. Printed in The Capitol, Washington, D.C., December 18, 1881. First question. You have heretofore incidentally expressed yourself on the matter of local suffrage in the District of Columbia. Have you any objections to giving your present views of the question? Ingersoll's answer.
I am still in favor of suffrage in the district. The real trouble is that before any substantial relief can be reached, there must be a change in the Constitution of the United States. The mere right to elect aldermen and mayors and policemen is of no great importance. It is a mistake to take all political power from the citizens of the district. Americans want to help rule the country. The district ought to have at least one representative in Congress and should elect one presidential elector. The people here should have a voice. They should feel that they are part of this country. They should have the right to sue in all federal courts precisely as though they were citizens of a state. This city ought to have 500,000 of inhabitants. Thousands would come here every year from every part of the Union, were it not for the fact that they do not wish to become political nothings. They think that citizenship is worth something, and they preserve it by staying away from Washington. This city is a flag of truce where wounded and dead politicians congregate, the Mecca of failures, the perdition of claimants, the purgatory of seekers after place, and the heaven only of those who neither want nor do anything. Nothing is manufactured, no solid business is done in this city, and there never will be until energetic, thrifty people wish to make it their home, and they will not wish that until the people of the district have something like the rights and political prospects of other citizens. It is hard to see why the right to representation should be taken from citizens living in the capital of the nation. The believers in free government should believe in a free capital.
Are there any valid reasons why the constitutional limitations to the elective franchise in the District of Columbia should not be removed by an amendment to that instrument?
I cannot imagine one. If our government is founded upon a correct principle, there can be no objection urged against suffrage in the district that cannot with equal force be urged against every part of the country. If freedom is dangerous here, it is safe nowhere. If a man cannot be trusted in the district, he is dangerous in the state. We do not trust the place where the man happens to be, we trust the man. The people of this district cannot remain in their present condition without becoming dishonored. The idea of allowing themselves to be governed by commissioners in whose selection they have no part is monstrous. The people here beg, implore, request, ask, pray, beseech, intercede, crave, urge, entreat, supplicate, memorialize, and most humbly petition, but they neither vote nor demand. They are not allowed to enter the Temple of Liberty. They stay in the lobby or sit on the steps.
They say Paris is France because her electors or citizens control that municipality. Do you foresee any danger of centralization in the full enfranchisement of the citizens of Washington?
There was a time when the intelligence of France was in Paris. The country was besotted, ignorant, Catholic. Paris was alive, educated, infidel, full of new theories of passion and heroism. For 200 years Paris was an athlete chained to a corpse. The corpse was the rest of France. It is different now, and the whole country is at last filling with light. Besides, Paris has 2 millions of people. It is filled with factories. It is not only the intellectual center, but the center of money and business as well. Let the corps législatif meet anywhere, and Paris will continue to be in a certain splendid sense France. Nothing like that can ever happen here, unless you expect Washington to outstrip New York, Philadelphia, and Chicago. If allowing the people of the District of Columbia to vote was the only danger to the Republic, I should be politically the happiest of men. I think it somewhat dangerous to deprive even one American citizen of the right to govern himself.
Would you have government clerks and officials appointed to office here, given the franchise in the district? And should this, if given, include the women clerks?
Citizenship should be determined here as in the States. Clerks should not be allowed to vote unless their intention is to make the district their home. When I make a government, I shall give 1 vote to each family. The unmarried should not be represented except by parents. Let the family be the unit of representation. Give each hearthstone a vote.
How do you regard the opposition of the local clergy and of the Bourbon democracy to enfranchising the citizens of the district?
I did not know that the clergy did oppose it. If, as you say, they do oppose it because they fear it will extend the liquor traffic, I think their reason exceedingly stupid. You cannot make men temperate by shutting up a few of the saloons and leaving others wide open. Intemperance must be met with other weapons. The Church ought not to appeal to force. What would the clergy of Washington think should the miracle of Cana be repeated in their day? Had they been in that country with their present ideas, what would they have said? After all, there is a great deal of philosophy in the following: better have the whole world voluntarily drunk than sober on compulsion. Of course the Bourbons object. Objecting is the business of a Bourbon. He always objects. If he does not understand the question, he objects because he does not, and if he does understand, he objects because he does. With him the reason for objecting is the fact that he does.
What effect, if any, would the complete franchise to our citizens have upon real estate and business in Washington?
If the people here had representation according to numbers, if the avenues to political preferment were open, if men here could take part in the real government of the country, if they could bring with them all their rights, this would be a great and splendid capital. We ought to have here a university, the best in the world, a library second to none, and here should be gathered the treasures of American art. The federal government has been infinitely economical in the direction of information. I hope the time will come when our government will give as much to educate 2 men as to kill 1.
This completes our interview, District Suffrage.